Today's story follows Officer Ethan Grant, a strict cop sent to patrol Riverside, a neighborhood with its own rules and resilience. At first, Ethan sees it as just another job, but as he faces tense encounters and surprising friendships, he's forced to confront his own hidden biases. Slowly, this community challenges everything he thought he knew. Can Ethan earn back the trust he risks losing? And will he discover a new purpose within Riverside's close-knit streets? If you're ready for a story of redemption and transformation, hit subscribe and comment below. Could you make the changes Ethan faces? Let's get into the story. The sky over Birkendale was still dusted in pre-dawn blue as Officer Ethan Grant steered his patrol car down the winding suburban roads. The gentle light of the rising sun was beginning to spill over the tops of the trees, casting long shadows on the streets and front lawns that made up the modest middle-class neighborhood he called home. The houses here were neat and well-kept, lined with American flags and manicured lawns, each one a small testament to the quiet pride and stability of the people who lived here. Birkendale was a town that took itself seriously, a place where things stayed comfortably the same year after year. Ethan glanced at his rearview mirror, catching sight of his son, Jamie, who was seated in the back, clutching his Spider-Man lunchbox in both hands. Jamie's face, bright with excitement, was framed by the morning light streaming through the window, illuminating his freckles and the slight gap in his front teeth that gave him a mischievous look. "Dad, guess what we're learning in school today?" Jamie's voice was filled with the boundless energy of a kid who found every new day full of promise. Ethan grinned as he looked at him in the mirror. "What's that, buddy?" "Miss Lopez says we're learning about different cultures and where our families come from," Jamie explained, his eyes wide with excitement. "She said we could bring something special that shows our family history, so I brought a picture of Grandma and Grandpa when they were young. Grandpa says they were around my age when they met." Ethan's smile faltered slightly. "That's great, son." He tried to sound as enthusiastic as he could. Family history wasn't something Ethan often thought about. His parents had grown up a few towns over, and as far as he was concerned, they'd lived simple, ordinary lives. But he knew Jamie's classmates came from families with roots spanning all over the world, countries Ethan had only read about in the news. He felt a twinge of discomfort, a reminder of how different his upbringing had been compared to Jamie's. "That's a great choice for show and tell, Jamie," Ethan added, reaching out to tousle his son's hair. "Just remember what we talked about, okay? Be kind, be careful, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself." Jamie nodded, his face solemn. "I remember, Dad, and I'll be nice to everyone, like you said." The conversation shifted as they arrived at Cloverbrook Elementary, a cheerful-looking school with a brick exterior and a sprawling green playground. Ethan slowed the car to a stop near the curb, where other parents were already lined up, dropping off their children with quick hugs and last-minute reminders. Jamie unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward, his face suddenly earnest. "Will you be here to pick me up later?" Ethan forced a reassuring smile. "Of course, buddy. I'll be right here after school." He watched as Jamie gave a little wave, then ran off toward the building, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders as he joined a group of friends at the entrance. Ethan felt a strange pang in his chest as he watched Jamie disappear into the school, his son, growing up in a world that often felt unrecognizable to Ethan. As the last of the stragglers made their way inside, Ethan finally pulled away from the curb. He had an hour before his shift officially began, and he planned to stop by the small coffee shop near the station, a quiet ritual he'd come to rely on in recent years. The bell above the door chimed as Ethan entered Charlie's Cafe, a small, locally owned coffee shop with dark wood furnishings and the cozy smell of freshly brewed coffee. He nodded to a few regulars, a retired couple who spent their mornings reading newspapers by the window, a young teacher marking papers, and a construction worker grabbing his morning coffee to go. This cafe was a part of his routine, a pocket of familiarity in an otherwise changing world. "Morning, Officer Grant," called out Charlie, the cafe's owner, from behind the counter. "Morning, Charlie," Ethan replied, giving a slight wave. He took his usual seat at the counter, and a steaming cup of black coffee was placed in front of him moments later. He sipped his coffee in silence, his mind wandering. Lately, he'd felt like something was slipping away, a sense of control, maybe or the sense of certainty he'd had when he first joined the police force. The world was changing, even here in Birkendale. And though he wasn't sure what bothered him most, he knew it was there, a persistent sense of unease he couldn't shake. As he finished his coffee, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back to the present. He glanced at the caller ID and saw his wife's name. Answering the call, he held the phone to his ear, his voice softening. "Hey, Maria. Everything okay?" Maria's voice was gentle, with that note of calmness she'd always had, though it was tinged with a trace of concern. "I just wanted to check in before your shift. You know, Ethan, you don't have to do the morning drop-off every day. Jamie's getting older, and he can handle it himself sometimes." Ethan leaned back, his jaw tightening slightly. "I know, but I like taking him. It gives me a chance to talk to him before the day starts." A pause stretched between them, and Ethan knew Maria was choosing her words carefully. "I understand that, Ethan. But I worry sometimes. You seem so focused on protecting him, on making sure he grows up exactly right. Maybe he just needs to see that the world isn't always something to be afraid of." Ethan felt his chest tighten, a mix of defensiveness and uncertainty swirling inside him. "I'm just doing my job, Maria. I want to keep him safe. The world isn't like it was when we were kids." "I know," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "But sometimes it feels like you're holding on to this fear. And maybe it's keeping you from seeing the good, too." They exchanged quiet goodbyes, and Ethan put his phone away, trying to push the conversation from his mind. But her words lingered, a reminder that the past he was holding on to might be doing more harm than good. As Ethan pulled up to the precinct, he received a call from his captain, redirecting him to Brookside Academy, a private school across town. The academy was well known in Birkendale for its high academic standards and the elite families who sent their children there. Ethan's new assignment, as his captain had explained, was to provide an added presence. This wasn't uncommon, as the school administration often requested extra officers to patrol the area, especially when students from diverse backgrounds began attending on scholarship. Arriving at the academy, Ethan parked on the perimeter, scanning the scene as parents dropped off their children, many of whom wore the academy's distinctive navy and gold uniforms. Brookside Academy's reputation was pristine, and its students came from families who valued structure, discipline, and achievement. For Ethan, it felt like the kind of place where everyone had their lives mapped out from day one, a far cry from his own modest upbringing. As he watched, his attention was drawn to two teenage girls walking toward the entrance. They wore the academy uniforms, but something about them stood out, drawing his suspicion. They looked younger than most students, and their expressions were a mix of calm and caution. Both had dark skin, their hair neatly styled in braids, and each carried a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. Ethan squinted, feeling a strange unease settle over him. He pulled his patrol car forward and rolled down the window, catching their attention. The girls stopped, exchanging a quick glance before turning toward him. "Excuse me," Ethan called out, stepping out of the car. "Are you students here?" One of the girls stepped forward, her expression polite but guarded. "Yes, sir. We're students at Brookside. My name's Zoe Carter, and this is my sister Mia." Ethan studied them for a moment, still uncertain. "ID cards?" The girls exchanged another glance, then reached into their bags, pulling out textbooks and notebooks, but neither produced an ID card. The other girl, Mia, looked at him with steady eyes. "We forgot our IDs at home, but we're in Mr. Hendricks' class. You can check with the office." Ethan folded his arms, his skepticism hardening. A lot of people use names to get out of situations. Just because you say you belong here doesn't mean I can believe you. A flash of frustration crossed Zoe's face, but she kept her tone calm. "Our dad is Nate Carter, sir. He's an attorney, if you need verification." Ethan's brow furrowed. Nate Carter was a well-known lawyer in the area, but seeing his daughters here, dressed in Brookside uniforms, still felt off. It wasn't that he thought they were lying, but something about their calm composure set him on edge. They didn't look intimidated. They looked resigned, as if they'd been through this before. "I think you both need to come with me to the station until we get this sorted out," he said, gesturing to his patrol car. Zoe's face fell, but she didn't argue. Instead, she exchanged a glance with Mia, and together they walked toward his car, slipping into the back seat without a word. Their silence was heavy, almost accusatory, as if they were daring him to reflect on what he'd just done. Ethan closed the door behind them, muttering under his breath as he returned to the driver's seat. He told himself he was doing his job, protecting the academy, but a part of him felt the faintest flicker of doubt. It was unsettling, though he quickly pushed it aside. As he drove toward the station, the radio crackled, and Ethan nearly jumped as the voice of his captain came through, sharp and impatient. "Grant, do you have any idea who those girls are?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "They're students, sir. I was just bringing them in to verify." A heavy silence hung over the line before his captain responded. "Those girls are the daughters of Nate Carter, the district attorney." Ethan's mouth went dry, and the gravity of his mistake hit him with a force he hadn't expected. Nate Carter was known throughout the city, and Ethan had just detained his daughters without cause. "Pull over," the captain ordered. "Release them immediately and report to my office when you're done." Ethan's hands trembled as he guided the car to the side of the road, the shame settling like a stone in his chest. When he opened the door for the girls, they stepped out in silence, their eyes holding an expression that was both hurt and disappointed. They didn't need to say anything. Their gaze alone told him everything he'd refused to see. As they walked away, heads held high, Ethan felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, heavier than his badge, his car, or anything else he'd carried in his years as an officer. He'd misjudged them, failed to see them for who they were, and now he would face the consequences of his own narrow vision. For the first time, he wondered if he truly understood the community he'd sworn to protect, or if he'd simply been trying to shield himself from it. The ride back to the precinct was a blur. Ethan's mind was a storm of guilt and confusion, and with each passing block, the weight of his actions seemed to grow heavier. The look on Zoe and Mia's faces replayed in his mind, their silent disappointment searing itself into his memory. As he pulled into the precinct parking lot, he felt a churning in his stomach, knowing his actions had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. He took a steadying breath before pushing open the precinct door and making his way to Captain Marsha Wilkins' office. She was a woman of few words, known for her no-nonsense approach, and as Ethan stepped inside, he felt the weight of her disapproval before she even spoke. "Sit down, Grant," she said curtly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him from behind her desk. Ethan sank into the chair, keeping his gaze lowered. His heart pounded as he waited, each tick of the clock behind her feeling like a small hammer blow to his conscience. Captain Wilkins folded her hands, her expression unreadable. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. Ethan swallowed hard, searching for the right words. I thought I was doing my job, Captain. I thought they were." "You thought." She cut him off, her tone cold. "You thought, and you acted on nothing more than a hunch. You detained 2 innocent young women because of your own assumptions. Do you know who those girls are?" He nodded, feeling a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. "Yes, ma'am. The daughters of the district attorney. And Nate Carter," she continued, her eyes hardening, "is a powerful figure in this city. You think he's going to let this slide? You've embarrassed this department. And more than that, you've undermined the trust we're supposed to be building with this community." Ethan felt a surge of defensiveness bubbling up, but he pushed it down, knowing it wouldn't help. "I understand, Captain. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to an almost dangerous calm. "This isn't a mistake, Grant. This is a pattern. I've seen how you patrol certain areas, how you look at certain people. You're vigilant, yes, but sometimes vigilance crosses into something else, something ugly." Ethan felt his jaw tighten, and his throat constricted as her words struck home. He wanted to protest, to tell her she was wrong, that he was only doing what was necessary. But deep down, a small part of him knew she wasn't entirely off the mark. "We're transferring you," she said, finally leaning back. "Effective immediately." His head snapped up, shock rippling through him. "Transfer? To where?" "To Riverside Precinct." Her voice was firm, leaving no room for negotiation. "You'll be working with Officer Daniel Foster. He's one of the best we have in that community, and I expect you to learn from him." Riverside. The word hit him like a punch. Riverside was the kind of place Ethan had spent his career avoiding. The area had a reputation: struggling schools, lower-income families, higher crime rates. He'd heard stories, seen news reports, and had always dismissed it as a place he'd never have to work. But now, it was where he was being sent. "I don't think that's necessary, Captain," he began, feeling desperation clawing at him. "I can." "No, Grant," she interrupted, her tone final. "This isn't a negotiation. You're going to Riverside, and you're going to learn what it means to serve a community that doesn't look like you, live like you, or even trust you. Consider this a chance to reshape your approach, if you're willing to take it." He clenched his fists, feeling the sting of humiliation. For a moment, he considered fighting it, but the look in her eyes told him it would be futile. "Understood, Captain," he said, his voice subdued. She nodded. "Dismissed." "And Grant? Don't make me regret giving you this chance." Ethan rose from the chair, his stomach knotted with shame and anger. He nodded stiffly and left her office, feeling as though he were leaving a piece of himself behind. By the time Ethan returned home, the sun was sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room where Maria was reading with Jamie. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the tension in his expression. She gently closed the book, giving Jamie a soft nudge to head upstairs before turning her attention to Ethan. "Something happened at work?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. Ethan nodded, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the words. "Yeah, something big." Maria waited, her face open, patient. He'd always admired that about her, the way she listened without judgment, allowing him to speak freely, even when it wasn't easy. "I'm being transferred," he finally said, his voice tight with frustration. "They're sending me to Riverside." Her eyebrows shot up, and she leaned forward, searching his face. "Riverside? That's pretty far from here." Ethan nodded, avoiding her gaze. "The captain thinks it'll be good for me. Something about understanding the community better." A silence fell between them, and he felt the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Maria's expression softened, her eyes filled with a mixture of empathy and quiet understanding. "What happened, Ethan?" she asked, her voice gentle. He took a deep breath, his mind replaying the events of the morning, the look on the Carter sisters' faces, his captain's harsh words. "I stopped 2 girls near Brookside Academy. Thought they looked out of place. Turns out, they were the district attorney's daughters." Maria's face fell, and she reached for his hand, her touch warm and grounding. "Oh, Ethan, I thought I was doing my job, Maria," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought I was protecting the school, but I realize now I was just acting on my own assumptions." She looked at him with a kind but steady gaze. "Ethan, I think this could be a good thing." He stared at her, incredulous. "You think me getting sent to Riverside is a good thing?" Maria nodded slowly. "I think it might be a chance for you to see things differently. Maybe to let go of some of the fear you're carrying." "Fear?" he repeated, a touch defensively. "Yes, fear," she said, holding his gaze. "I see it every day in the way you talk to Jamie, the way you hold on to the past, always worried about something going wrong. Maybe this transfer isn't a punishment, Ethan. Maybe it's a way to help you understand that there's more to people than what you see on the surface." He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew there was truth in what she was saying, but acknowledging it felt like admitting defeat. He sighed, looking away. "Maybe," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Maria squeezed his hand, her expression full of compassion. "Just give it a chance. Sometimes, the things we're most afraid of are the ones that help us grow the most." Her words lingered in his mind as he prepared for bed that night, his mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. Riverside was unknown, a place filled with stories and struggles he'd never experienced firsthand. But as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he needed this as much as he dreaded it. The next morning, Ethan sat across from Jamie at the breakfast table, watching his son pour milk over a bowl of cereal with careful precision. Jamie's innocence, his uncomplicated view of the world, made Ethan's chest ache with both love and fear. "Jamie," he began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you." Jamie looked up, his big brown eyes curious. "What's up, Dad?" Ethan cleared his throat, feeling an odd sense of vulnerability. I'm going to be working in a different part of town for a while. It's not too far, but I won't be around as much during the day. Jamie frowned slightly, setting down his spoon. Where are you going? Riverside. Ethan replied, trying to keep his tone light. It's a different neighborhood, a place I'm not used to, but I think it'll be good for me. Jamie's brow furrowed, and Ethan could see the wheels turning in his son's mind. Is Riverside dangerous? Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Well, it's different from here, but there are a lot of good people there, and I'll be working with Officer Foster. He knows the area well. Jamie nodded slowly, still processing. Will you be back for dinner? The simple question hit Ethan harder than he expected. A reminder of the everyday routines he'd be leaving behind. I'll try my best, buddy. And on the weekends, I'll be home for sure. Jamie was quiet for a moment, his small hands folded on the table. Are you scared, Dad? The question caught him off guard. Jamie's gaze was direct, unblinking, and Ethan felt a swell of emotion he couldn't quite name. He took a deep breath, meeting his son's eyes. A little, yeah, he admitted. But sometimes, doing something scary helps us become stronger. You know that, right? Jamie nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Like when I had to stand up to those kids in school? Ethan chuckled, reaching across the table to ruffle Jamie's hair. Exactly like that. As Jamie returned to his cereal, Ethan felt a small measure of comfort settle over him. His son, innocent yet wise beyond his years, had a way of grounding him, reminding him of the reasons behind everything he did. Riverside was an unknown, a place he'd long avoided, but as he prepared for his first day there, he felt a faint glimmer of something he hadn't expected: hope. For the first time, he wondered if there was more to this transfer than punishment. Maybe, as Maria had said, it was a chance to shed his fears, to see people as they truly were, and to build something new. As he left the house that morning, he felt the weight of his badge differently, as though it were a tool of service rather than just a symbol of authority. And though he still felt the lingering doubt, he promised himself he would approach this assignment with an open mind, determined to find a way to make things right. Ethan took a deep breath as he turned his car onto River Street, the main artery running through Riverside. The neighborhood looked different from Birkendale in every way. The buildings were older, some showing signs of wear, and the streets were lined with small businesses, some with hand-painted signs. Corner stores, barber shops, and food carts dotted the sidewalks, each with its own sense of history and pride. He'd grown up hearing stories about Riverside, and now, being here felt surreal, as though he were stepping into a place he'd only seen from the outside. He drove past a mural painted on the side of an old brick building, a vibrant depiction of Riverside's history, a tapestry of faces and stories that had shaped the community over decades. There was something raw, something undeniably real about this place, yet he couldn't shake a sense of unease. Ethan pulled into the precinct parking lot, the modest brick building seeming almost unassuming compared to the larger, modern precincts he was used to. His heart thudded in his chest as he glanced around, taking in the rows of patrol cars, the faded signage, the officers coming and going with an air of both purpose and camaraderie. As he stepped out of his car, a voice called out from behind him. "You must be Grant," the voice said, warm and steady. Ethan turned to see Officer Daniel Foster approaching, his hand extended in greeting. Foster was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a face that looked like it had seen everything, yet maintained an openness Ethan wasn't used to seeing in veteran officers. Ethan reached out, shaking Foster's hand with a firm grip. "Yes, sir. Officer Ethan Grant. Captain Wilkins sent me over." "Glad you made it," Foster said with a smile that reached his eyes. "Around here, everyone just calls me Danny. No need for formalities in Riverside." Ethan nodded, feeling a flicker of relief at Foster's approachable demeanor. But the weight of being the new guy, especially one with a recent history of misjudgment, settled heavily on him. "Let's get you oriented," Foster continued, motioning for Ethan to follow him into the precinct. Inside, Riverside's precinct was a world away from the slick, high-tech stations Ethan was used to. The walls were adorned with community photos, kids playing basketball, elderly residents sitting on stoops, volunteers handing out food. It was clear this precinct was more than just a workplace. It was embedded in the fabric of the neighborhood. As Foster led him through the halls, he gestured to the walls, his voice filled with a kind of reverence. Every face on this wall has a story. These aren't just people we protect. They're our neighbors, our friends. We know them, and they know us. Ethan tried to take it all in, feeling a sense of disconnect. At his last precinct, he kept his work separate from his personal life, rarely seeing the same people more than once or twice. But here, it seemed officers were expected to be part of the community, to go beyond the uniform. They arrived at a small, crowded office at the end of the hall. Foster knocked, and a woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile looked up from her desk. She was middle-aged, with neatly braided hair and a firm, no-nonsense demeanor. "Ethan, this is Sergeant Carla Lopez," Foster said. "She's been with Riverside for nearly 2 decades and knows this neighborhood like the back of her hand." Lopez shook his hand, giving him a quick, appraising look. "Welcome to Riverside, Grant. We're a small team here, so we work closely with each other and with the community. We expect you to get involved, to know the people you're protecting. Are you up for that?" Ethan hesitated, feeling a hint of defensiveness rise in him. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to do my job." Her smile softened slightly. "Doing your job means more than just enforcing the law here, Grant. It means understanding these people, seeing them as more than faces on a report. Riverside needs officers who care." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't entirely sure he understood what she meant, but he sensed that he'd learn soon enough. A short while later, Ethan found himself in a patrol car with Foster, driving through the winding streets of Riverside. It felt strange to be the one sitting in the passenger seat, watching as someone else navigated the route. "People here are close," Foster began, his voice calm and conversational. "This neighborhood may have its problems, but there's a loyalty here you don't find in most places. They look out for each other." Ethan glanced out the window, watching as a group of kids played soccer in a vacant lot. A few people waved as they passed, smiling in recognition at Foster. Ethan noted the genuine warmth in their greetings, something that felt almost foreign to him. "How long have you been working here?" Ethan asked, trying to fill the silence with small talk. Foster chuckled. "I've been with Riverside for over 15 years. I started out in a precinct not too different from yours, but I transferred here after a few years. Never looked back." Ethan nodded, feeling a mixture of respect and confusion. "What made you stay?" Foster's gaze softened as he looked out at the neighborhood. "People here remind me of where I grew up. They don't ask for much, just someone to see them, to listen. Working here, it gives you purpose." Ethan shifted in his seat, feeling a flicker of discomfort. Purpose was something he hadn't thought about in years. For him, policing had always been about maintaining order, following the rules. But as he watched Foster's interactions with the people of Riverside, he sensed that there was something more here, something he wasn't yet prepared to understand. As the day wore on, they made a stop near the Riverside Youth Center, a modest building with colorful murals painted on the exterior walls. Kids of all ages were gathered outside, playing basketball, chatting, and laughing. Ethan noticed a teenage boy dribbling a ball with impressive speed and precision, his tall frame and quick reflexes drawing the attention of other kids. "That's Malik Jackson," Foster said, nodding toward the boy. "Smart kid. Wants to be an engineer someday. Got a scholarship to the academy, but his family's struggling." Ethan watched Malik as he shot a perfect basket, the ball arcing gracefully before swishing through the hoop. There was something magnetic about him, a quiet confidence that made him stand out. Malik looked over, catching sight of Foster and nodding with a grin. "Hey, Officer Foster," he called, jogging over. His gaze shifted to Ethan, his expression growing slightly more guarded. "This is Officer Grant," Foster introduced, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He's new to Riverside, so you'll probably see him around." Malik's eyes lingered on Ethan, assessing. "Nice to meet you, Officer Grant," he said, his tone polite but reserved. Ethan forced a smile, unsure of what to say. "Good to meet you too, Malik." They stood in an awkward silence for a moment before Malik gave a nod and returned to his game. Ethan watched him go, feeling an odd pang of envy. These kids seemed comfortable here, connected in a way he'd never felt growing up. "Malik's one of the good ones," Foster said, his tone contemplative. but he's got pressure from all sides. Sometimes, it's hard for kids like him to stay on the right path. Ethan didn't respond, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Malik's story. Riverside, it seemed, was full of people with stories, each one more complex than the last. That evening, as they wrapped up their patrol, Foster suggested they stop by a local diner for coffee. The Riverside Diner was a cozy, no-frills establishment with checkered floors and the smell of freshly baked pies. The waitress greeted Foster by name, giving Ethan a polite nod as she took their order. As they waited, Foster leaned back in the booth, his gaze steady. You know, Grant, policing isn't just about enforcing the law. Sometimes it's about listening. Ethan frowned, unsure of where Foster was going with this. Listening? Yeah. Foster took a sip of his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. People here don't trust easily, and with good reason. They've been through a lot, and they don't need an officer who's here to check boxes. They need someone who'll actually listen to them, who'll see them as people, not just potential threats. Ethan bristled slightly, feeling the underlying implication. I'm here to do my job, Foster. I'm not trying to change who I am. Foster smiled, a patient look in his eyes. I get that, but sometimes doing your job means stepping outside of yourself. Riverside isn't just another precinct. It's a community, and communities need more than just laws. They need respect. Ethan sat back, his mind churning. He'd come here to serve his transfer, to prove he could handle the assignment and move on. But as he looked around the diner, at the familiar faces greeting each other, the laughter and quiet conversations, he felt a flicker of doubt. Could he really make a difference here? Or would he remain the outsider, a stranger in a place that needed more than just his authority? As they finished their coffee and headed back to the precinct, Ethan felt the weight of Foster's words settling over him. Riverside was more than he'd expected, more than he understood. And for the first time, he wondered if he was capable of truly listening to the people, to the community, and to himself. A week had passed since Ethan's first day in Riverside. He was slowly settling into the rhythm of the neighborhood, though he still felt like an outsider. He'd spent most of his patrols with Foster, listening and observing, trying to absorb the older officer's patient approach to law enforcement. On a cloudy Thursday afternoon, they were patrolling near Maple Street when a call came in over the radio. It was a domestic disturbance on the other side of town. Foster picked up the receiver, his face serious as he listened to the dispatcher's voice. "We're on it," he replied, glancing at Ethan before steering the patrol car toward the address. The address led them to a small, rundown apartment building with peeling paint and cracked windows. Outside, a crowd had gathered, their faces tense as they murmured quietly. Foster parked, and as they approached, a middle-aged woman with a worried expression stepped forward. "Officer Foster, thank God you're here," she said, wringing her hands. "It's Ray again. He and his girlfriend are fighting. I think it's bad this time." Ethan tensed, immediately ready to intervene. Foster gave the woman a reassuring nod and signaled for Ethan to follow him. They made their way up a narrow staircase, the smell of stale smoke and damp plaster filling the air. At the top of the stairs, they could hear Ray's voices coming from one of the apartments. Ethan's hand hovered near his holster, his instincts on high alert. But Foster motioned for him to pause, taking a deep breath before knocking on the door. The shouting stopped abruptly, and after a tense moment, the door cracked open. A young man, barely out of his teens, peered out, his eyes wary and bloodshot. Ethan recognized him immediately. Ray, the same kid who'd argued with Malik outside the youth center. "Ray," Foster said, his tone calm but firm. "Can we come in and talk?" Ray hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder before nodding and opening the door. Inside, the apartment was small and cluttered, with worn furniture and a sagging couch. A young woman sat on the couch, her face streaked with tears, her expression a mix of anger and exhaustion. Ethan's instincts told him to assert control, to make it clear that violence wouldn't be tolerated. But he watched as Foster approached Ray, his voice gentle yet authoritative. "Ray, we're here to help. Tell us what's going on." Ray looked away, his shoulders slumping. It's nothing. Just a stupid argument. We don't need any cops getting involved." The young woman looked up, her eyes flashing with frustration. Nothing? Ray, this isn't nothing. You've been drinking, and every time you get like this. Foster held up a hand, signaling her to pause. Let's take this one step at a time, he said. He turned to Ray, his tone patient. I know things have been rough for you lately. It's not easy dealing with all this, is it? Ray's defensiveness wavered, and he ran a hand through his hair, his expression filled with regret. No, it's been hard. Ethan watched the exchange, surprised by Foster's approach. He would have handled things differently, more decisively, more by the book. But as he listened to Foster's calm words, he saw Ray's guard begin to lower. Foster spent the next few minutes talking with them, asking questions, listening. Slowly, the tension in the room began to ease. By the time they left, Ray had agreed to attend counseling sessions offered at the youth center, and his girlfriend had taken a list of resources from Foster. As they walked back to the patrol car, Ethan felt a mix of admiration and frustration. Why didn't you just take him in? He asked, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. Foster gave him a sidelong glance. And then what? He spends a night in jail, gets released, and the cycle starts all over again? We're here to break cycles, Ethan, not just enforce rules. Ethan didn't respond, but the words lingered with him, challenging everything he thought he knew about policing. Later that evening, Ethan decided to visit the youth center alone. Foster had spoken highly of the programs offered there, and part of him wanted to see for himself what it was all about. When he arrived, the center was buzzing with activity. Kids playing basketball in the gym, others working on homework at a row of tables. He spotted Malik in a corner, deep in concentration over a science textbook. Ethan approached, clearing his throat to get the young man's attention. Hey Malik, he said, keeping his tone light. How's it going? Malik looked up, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. Officer Grant, he replied, his tone polite but guarded. Didn't expect to see you here. Ethan shifted, feeling slightly out of place. Thought I'd drop by. I heard you're a bit of a science whiz. Malik's expression softened, a hint of pride flickering in his eyes. I'm all right. I'm working on this engineering project for school, trying to build a small solar-powered generator. Ethan nodded, genuinely impressed. Sounds like a big project. What got you interested in engineering? Malik shrugged, a small smile crossing his face. It's a way to make things better, I guess. My mom always said I was good with my hands, and I've been interested in fixing things ever since I was a kid. Guess I figured I might as well try to do something useful with it. They stood in silence for a moment, and Ethan felt a pang of regret as he realized how easily he'd dismissed Malik and other kids like him in the past. You know, he began, choosing his words carefully, a lot of people don't get to see this side of you. They might think you're just another kid in the neighborhood. Malik looked away, his face tightening. People see what they want to see, Officer Grant. Doesn't matter if I get good grades or stay out of trouble. Some people already have their minds made up about me. Ethan felt a familiar sting, a reminder of his own assumptions. You're right, he said quietly. But I think you're doing something important here, Malik. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Malik's gaze softened, and for a moment, Ethan saw the guarded young man let down his defenses. Thanks, Officer Grant. I appreciate that. As they talked about Malik's project, Ethan felt a shift within himself, a growing awareness that he was beginning to understand Riverside in a way he hadn't expected. Malik, like so many others here, was more than the stereotypes Ethan had held. As the week wore on, Ethan continued his patrols, joining Foster in the daily routine of Riverside life. One evening, as they were wrapping up, a call came in for a robbery at a nearby convenience store. Ethan's heart pounded as they sped to the scene, adrenaline flooding his system. When they arrived, the store owner, an older man named Mr. Patel, was standing outside, his hands trembling. They took everything, he stammered, his face pale. Cash, cigarettes, even the candy from the counter. Foster placed a comforting hand on Mr. Patel's shoulder, asking him gentle questions, jotting down descriptions as he spoke. Ethan scanned the area, his eyes sharp, searching for any sign of the suspects. It's the third time this month, Mr. Patel said, his voice shaky. I don't know how much longer I can keep this place running. Ethan felt a surge of anger, the instinct to chase down the perpetrators and bring them to justice. But as he looked around the store, at the empty shelves and broken glass, he also felt a pang of helplessness. This wasn't just about crime. It was about survival, about people trying to make an honest living despite the challenges around them. "We'll do everything we can to catch them," Foster assured him, his voice steady. "In the meantime, let us know if there's anything we can do to help." As they drove back to the precinct, Ethan's frustration boiled over. "This place is falling apart," he muttered, his fists clenching. "How are we supposed to make a difference when it feels like everything is stacked against us?" Foster glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "It's hard, Ethan. No denying that. But we're not here to fix everything. We're here to do what we can, one day at a time. Sometimes it's enough just to show up, to let people know they're not alone." Ethan looked away, his mind racing. Riverside was challenging him in ways he hadn't expected, forcing him to confront his own limitations, his own biases. And as much as he resisted, he couldn't deny the truth in Foster's words. Showing up, being present, maybe that was where real change began. Over the next few days, Ethan made a point to get to know the people he encountered on his patrols. He stopped by Mr. Patel's store, checking in on him, offering a friendly greeting to the regular customers. He found himself lingering at the youth center, watching the kids play, feeling a strange sense of pride in Malik's progress. Slowly, he began to notice a shift in the way people treated him. At first, it was just a nod here, a polite good morning there. But as the days went on, some of the shopkeepers and residents started to greet him by name. Kids on bikes waved as he passed, their laughter filling the streets with a sense of warmth he hadn't expected. One evening, as he walked back to his car, a young girl ran up to him, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in her small hands. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you Officer Grant?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan crouched down to her level, offering a gentle smile. "That's me. What can I do for you?" She handed him the paper, a carefully drawn crayon picture of a police officer with a big smile and a badge. "I made this for you," she said shyly. "My mama says you're nice." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the picture, realizing the impact his presence had made, even in such a short time. He felt a surge of gratitude, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt before. For the first time since arriving in Riverside, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of change. He thanked the girl, watching as she ran back to her mother with a bright smile. As he tucked the picture into his pocket, he felt the weight of his badge lighten, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. The autumn wind was sharp, sweeping through Riverside with a chill that seemed to carry the promise of rain. Ethan was on patrol, alone this time, when a call came over the radio, a missing child. The urgency in the dispatcher's voice made his pulse quicken as he took down the details. 8-year-old Isaiah Johnson had disappeared from a playground near Maple Street, last seen playing with friends before he wandered off toward a nearby alley. Ethan was close, and as he pulled up to the park, he spotted a small cluster of people, their faces filled with worry. Isaiah's mother, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks, was speaking with another officer, her hands clutching a crumpled tissue. Ethan approached, his voice steady. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Grant. I'm here to help. Can you tell me anything about where Isaiah might have gone?" She looked at him, desperation flickering in her eyes. He loves hiding places," she stammered. "Whenever we play hide and seek, he finds the tightest spots. But he always comes back when I call. This isn't like him." Ethan nodded, taking in every detail. He could see the strain on her face, the fear. He turned to the other officer, exchanging a look that conveyed their shared urgency. They needed to find Isaiah, and fast. He set off, combing the nearby streets, calling out Isaiah's name. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. But as he passed a small alleyway, something caught his eye, a flash of red against the gray of the pavement. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart pounding as he spotted Isaiah crouched behind a dumpster, his face streaked with tears. Relief surged through him as he knelt down, his voice gentle. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, trying not to startle the boy. "Your mom's really worried about you. Let's go back and let her know you're okay, all right?" Isaiah's tearful eyes looked up at him, his small frame trembling. I got lost, he whispered, his voice thick with fear. Ethan offered a reassuring smile, holding out his hand. It's all right. I'm here now. Let's get you home. As they walked back toward the park, Isaiah clung to his hand, and Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him. By the time they reached the playground, Isaiah's mother ran forward, gathering her son in her arms, her face crumpling in relief. Thank you, she whispered to Ethan, her voice thick with gratitude. Thank you so much. Ethan nodded, feeling an unexpected swell of pride. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a moment of connection, a glimpse of the trust he was starting to earn. He'd shown up when it mattered, and that, he realized, was what Riverside needed most. A few days later, Ethan was patrolling alone near the Riverside Community Center when he noticed a small crowd gathered near the corner. He recognized some of the teenagers from the youth center, and Malik was among them, his expression tense as he faced off against a young man wearing a leather jacket and a hard look in his eyes. Ethan approached, catching snippets of the argument. The guy in the leather jacket, Carlos, one of the more notorious kids in the neighborhood, was demanding money from Malik, his tone aggressive. You think you're better than us, huh, Malik? Carlos sneered, shoving Malik's shoulder. Got that scholarship now, so you're too good for us? Malik held his ground, though his face was pale. I'm just trying to make something of myself, Carlos. I don't owe you anything. Ethan's instincts kicked in as he stepped forward, his presence catching the attention of the crowd. Is there a problem here? Carlos turned, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Ethan. This doesn't concern you, officer. Just a little neighborhood chat. Ethan didn't flinch, keeping his tone firm. I'm making it my concern. Malik's got a future ahead of him, and you're not going to interfere with that. Carlos scoffed, his gaze filled with defiance. Look at you, all high and mighty. You think you know this neighborhood, but you don't understand anything about us. Ethan held his ground, feeling the tension radiating from the crowd. I'm here to protect everyone in Riverside, Carlos, including you. But you need to respect other people's choices. Carlos's face twisted in anger, but he seemed to realize he was outnumbered, his gaze flickering to the crowd. After a moment, he stepped back, sneering. Whatever, man. This place doesn't need cops like you pretending to care. With that, he turned and stalked off, leaving a murmur of whispers in his wake. Ethan looked at Malik, who gave him a nod of appreciation, the unspoken gratitude clear in his eyes. As the crowd dispersed, Ethan felt the weight of Carlos's words settling over him. He still had a long way to go in earning this community's trust, but he wasn't about to back down. The confrontation with Carlos seemed to leave a shadow over Malik, and Ethan noticed the young man's energy seemed dampened in the days that followed. One afternoon, Ethan found Malik alone at the youth center, staring at the basketball court with a distant expression. Hey, Malik, Ethan said, approaching him. You all right? Malik shrugged, his gaze still distant. I don't know. It feels like no matter what I do, people like Carlos are always going to see me as one of them. And people outside of Riverside, they see me as a threat. Ethan felt a pang of empathy, understanding Malik's struggle in a way he hadn't before. It's tough, isn't it? Trying to be true to yourself when it feels like everyone's got their own opinion about who you are. Malik nodded, his eyes clouded with frustration. I want more than this. But sometimes, it feels like I'm fighting against something I can't change. Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I've learned that change isn't easy, Malik. It's uncomfortable, and sometimes it makes people angry. But that doesn't mean it's not worth it. For a moment, they stood in silence, and Ethan could feel the weight of Malik's decision hovering between them. In Malik, he saw a younger version of himself, a kid who was torn between two worlds, unsure of where he truly belonged. Finally, Malik looked up, his gaze steady. I'm not going to give up. I've come too far to let someone like Carlos drag me down. Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of pride. Good. You've got more strength than you realize, Malik. They shook hands, and as Malik walked away, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Riverside was changing him, and maybe in some small way, he was helping to change it too. A few weeks later, just as Ethan was starting to feel like he was truly a part of Riverside, an incident shattered his fragile trust with the community. It happened during a routine call one evening. A convenience store on 8th Street had been robbed, and Ethan was first on the scene. As he approached, he spotted a young man sprinting from the alley behind the store. Instinctively, he pursued, adrenaline pumping as he chased the suspect down several side streets. When he finally caught up, he grabbed the young man's arm, turning him around, and found himself staring into Malik's terrified face. "Malik." Ethan's voice was filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Malik's expression was one of shock and hurt, his eyes wide as he took a shaky breath. "Officer Grant, I didn't do anything. I was just walking home." Ethan felt his grip loosen, uncertainty gnawing at him. But the store clerk had described someone who looked like Malik, and the circumstantial evidence was strong. "Malik, you have to understand," Ethan said, his voice torn. "I'm just doing my job." Malik pulled his arm free, his expression a mixture of betrayal and anger. "So that's it? After everything, you still see me as just another suspect?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Malik was already walking away, his shoulders hunched, his steps quickening as he disappeared into the night. Ethan felt a hollow ache in his chest, the weight of his own actions settling heavily over him. He thought he was making progress, thought he was learning. But in that moment, he realized that all it took was a single misstep to unravel everything. The days following the incident with Malik were a blur. Word spread quickly, and suddenly, the warm greetings and friendly smiles Ethan had come to expect vanished. People looked at him with suspicion. Conversations stopped when he walked by, and the once familiar neighborhood now felt like hostile territory. Foster noticed the change in Ethan's demeanor, his usually calm expression turning serious as he pulled Ethan aside one morning. "Want to tell me what's going on?" Ethan shook his head, feeling the weight of his guilt. I messed up, Foster. I accused Malik of something he didn't do. I thought I'd moved past my assumptions, but it's like they're still there, beneath the surface." Foster placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his expression sympathetic. "It's hard to change, Ethan, but acknowledging your mistakes, that's where growth begins." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let this be the end of his journey. He'd come too far, learned too much. He needed to make things right. Ethan spent the following week reaching out to the people he'd wronged, taking the time to listen and apologize. He met with Malik, sitting across from him at the youth center, his voice thick with remorse. "I was wrong, Malik," he said, his eyes filled with regret. "I let my past biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better." Malik looked at him, his expression softened but guarded. "You know, Officer Grant, I believed you were different. And maybe you still can be, but you have to prove it." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of Malik's words. He knew redemption wouldn't come easy, but he was willing to put in the work. Slowly, over the coming weeks, he rebuilt the bridges he'd burned, showing up not as an officer enforcing the law, but as a member of the Riverside community, someone who truly cared. And as the days turned into months, he began to see the change, not only in the way people treated him, but in the way he saw himself. He was no longer just Ethan Grant, the officer. He was part of Riverside, a place that had taught him the power of humility, empathy, and second chances. Ethan spent the next several days immersing himself fully in Riverside, determined to prove his commitment to the community and earn back the trust he'd lost. It wasn't easy. Conversations were terse, the greetings were less frequent, and the sense of camaraderie he'd begun to feel had dissipated, replaced by guarded glances and quiet whispers. Determined to turn things around, Ethan took to visiting local spots, lending a hand wherever he could. He spent an afternoon helping the youth center repaint its faded walls, his hands covered in streaks of green and blue by the end of it. He volunteered to assist at a neighborhood cleanup, working side by side with residents to clear debris from the sidewalks and plant new flowers in the local park. Each action was a small step, a gesture toward rebuilding the connection he'd lost. One evening, as he finished sweeping the steps of the community center, he was approached by Mrs. Washington, an elderly woman who had lived in Riverside for decades. Her weathered face held years of wisdom, and her eyes, though kind, held a skeptical glint as she looked him over. "Officer Grant," she said, her voice steady and clear, You've been putting in a lot of time here lately. You trying to prove something? Ethan wiped his brow, meeting her gaze directly. I'm trying to make up for my mistakes, Mrs. Washington. I know I haven't always seen things clearly, and I know I've made it hard for people here to trust me. I just want to show that I'm here for the right reasons. She studied him for a moment, her expression softening. Trust is hard to earn, but it's worth the work. You keep doing what you're doing, and people might start to see you for who you are. Her words settled over him like a quiet blessing, and as she turned to walk away, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was beginning to see Riverside not just as a place he worked, but as a place he wanted to protect, a place he cared about deeply. A few days later, as Ethan was finishing a shift at the precinct, he noticed Malik standing outside, his hands stuffed in his pockets and a guarded look on his face. Surprised, Ethan approached him, uncertain of what to expect. "Malik," he greeted, keeping his tone neutral. "Didn't expect to see you here. Is everything all right?" Malik shifted, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I didn't come here because I wanted to, Officer Grant," he said, his voice carrying a mix of frustration and vulnerability. "But my mom, she told me I should hear you out." Ethan nodded, his heart beating faster. "I'd like that. Can we talk?" Malik hesitated before giving a brief nod, and they walked to a nearby park, finding a quiet bench away from the street noise. The silence stretched between them, tense and filled with unspoken words, until Ethan finally broke it. "Malik, I know I hurt you," he began, his voice low, "and I can't take back what I did, but I want you to know that I'm committed to being better, to learning from my mistakes." Malik looked away, his jaw clenched. "It's easy to say that, Officer Grant, but you don't know what it's like to be judged just because of how you look, how you dress, or where you're from. You saw me as a suspect, not as a kid who's trying to make something of himself." Ethan's chest tightened, Malik's words cutting through his defenses. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his past assumptions pressing down on him. "You're right. I didn't see you for who you were. And I'm sorry. I know words don't mean much, but I'm here to listen, to really listen this time." Malik's shoulders relaxed, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "All right, Officer Grant, I'll give you a chance. But understand this. People here need someone they can trust, not someone who's going to look at them like they're criminals. We're just people trying to live our lives." Ethan felt a surge of gratitude, recognizing the courage it took for Malik to give him this chance. "Thank you, Malik. I won't take this lightly." They sat in silence, a tentative understanding growing between them. For the first time, Ethan felt as though he'd been given a real opportunity, not just to be part of Riverside, but to be someone who made a positive impact here. The following weekend, the Riverside Youth Center held its annual basketball tournament, a major event in the community. Ethan had been asked to volunteer as a referee, and he found himself standing on the sidelines, surrounded by cheering kids and parents, his heart warmed by the sense of unity in the air. As the games went on, Malik's team quickly emerged as one of the top contenders. Malik was a natural leader on the court, encouraging his teammates and strategizing each play with a confidence that impressed Ethan. He could see Malik's determination in every shot, every pass, as though he were playing not just for a win, but for a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. In the final game, with only a few seconds left on the clock, Malik made a crucial steal and passed the ball to a teammate, who scored the winning basket just as the buzzer sounded. The crowd erupted in cheers, parents and kids flooding the court to celebrate. Ethan watched, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he saw the pride on Malik's face. As the crowd began to disperse, Malik approached him, his expression a mix of excitement and humility. "Thanks for being here, Officer Grant," he said, his voice steady. "It means a lot to have you see us for who we really are." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him, the sincerity in Malik's words resonating deeply. "Thank you for letting me, Malik. You're a great player and a great leader." They shook hands, and in that moment, Ethan felt as though he'd finally crossed a bridge he'd been struggling to reach for so long. Malik's acceptance was a gift, one he was determined to honor. As the weeks passed, Ethan's dedication to Riverside continued to grow. He'd become a familiar face, someone people could rely on and turn to for help. He spent evenings at the youth center, volunteered at local events, and developed friendships with shopkeepers, parents, and the kids he saw each day. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from his old precinct. Captain Wilkins was on the line, her tone serious as she offered him the opportunity to return. His record had been cleared, and he was welcome to come back if he wanted. The news left him stunned, torn between the familiarity of his old life and the new connections he'd forged in Riverside. As he hung up the phone, Ethan felt a mix of emotions, his mind racing with the possibilities. Returning would mean rejoining his family and friends, the world he'd always known. But staying in Riverside felt like a calling, a chance to be part of something greater than himself. Later that evening, he met with Foster at the diner, seeking his advice. Over coffee, Ethan explained his dilemma, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him. Foster listened, his face calm and thoughtful. "Ethan, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this. Riverside has a way of getting under your skin, of showing you things you didn't know you needed to see. It's a hard place to work, but it's real. And if you leave, you'll take a piece of this place with you." Ethan nodded, his heart conflicted. He knew Foster was right. Riverside had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated, shaping him into someone he was proud to be. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan thought of the people he'd come to care about. The faces he passed on his patrols, the friendships he'd built, the trust he'd fought so hard to earn. And as dawn broke over Riverside, he made his decision. The next morning, Ethan reported to the precinct, his resolve clear. He approached Foster, a hint of a smile on his face. "I'm staying," he said simply. "Riverside is where I need to be." Foster's face broke into a broad grin, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "Good choice, Ethan. This place needs people like you, people who see it for what it really is." As the day went on, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he'd chosen to stay true to his new path. He was no longer just passing through Riverside. He was a part of it. In the days that followed, Ethan noticed a shift in the way people treated him. The guarded glances turned into nods of recognition. The smiles grew warmer, and the trust he'd fought to build finally felt earned. One evening, as he walked down Maple Street, he spotted Malik and a group of kids playing basketball in the fading light. Malik waved him over, his face breaking into a grin. "Officer Grant," he called, tossing the ball to him. "Let's see if you can keep up with us." Ethan laughed, catching the ball and joining in the game, his movements blending with the rhythm of the court. Laughter and shouts filled the air, and for a moment, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Riverside wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a community, a place filled with stories, struggles, and resilience. And as he played alongside Malik and the others, Ethan knew he'd finally found his place within it. Months later, Ethan sat on the steps of the youth center, watching the sunset over Riverside. The community had become his second home, its people his extended family. He'd come here as an outsider, burdened by his own prejudices and assumptions. But he was leaving behind those fears, embracing the lessons he'd learned. Riverside had shown him the power of listening, the strength of humility, and the importance of treating people as individuals, not stereotypes. It had taught him that change was possible, not just in the people he served, but within himself. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Malik joined him on the steps, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for sticking around, Officer Grant," he said quietly. "This place, it's better because of you." Ethan looked at him, his heart full. "No, Malik. I'm the one who's better because of this place. And because of people like you." They sat together, watching the neighborhood settle into the evening calm, a silence that spoke of trust and mutual respect. Riverside had transformed Ethan in ways he hadn't imagined, grounding him in a purpose he'd been searching for all along. And as he sat there, surrounded by the sights and sounds of a place he now called home, he knew he'd found something he couldn't have found anywhere else. Months had passed since Ethan chose to stay in Riverside, and he had settled into his role with a newfound sense of purpose. The trust he'd fought to earn now felt natural. Greetings from shopkeepers, nods of respect from teens on the street, and knowing smiles from parents at the youth center reminded him of how far he had come. Ethan took on more responsibility in Riverside, including organizing community events and helping implement programs for youth development. He'd even started a series of weekly coffee with a cop events at the local diner, where residents could meet officers in a relaxed and formal setting. The program allowed people to voice their concerns, share their stories, and get to know the officers who serve their neighborhood. One brisk autumn morning, Ethan arrived early at the diner, setting out flyers for an upcoming Riverside food drive. As he arranged the chairs, Mrs. Washington walked in, her expression softened by a knowing smile. "Officer Grant," she greeted, her voice warm. "I've never seen anyone turn around like you have. This community is better with you here." Ethan smiled, the sincerity in her words lifting his spirits. "Thank you, Mrs. Washington. This place changed me too. It's home now." She nodded thoughtfully, her gaze distant. "Home is where we find purpose, Ethan. And you've found yours." As the first residents trickled in for coffee, Ethan reflected on how this community had given him purpose and had changed his view of policing. He was no longer just a guardian of the law. He was part of the fabric of Riverside, working to build trust, create safety, and foster understanding. Malik was in his senior year, his ambition of becoming an engineer clearer than ever. Ethan had become a mentor to him, meeting weekly to discuss his future, and recently, he'd introduced Malik to a local engineering firm that offered internships for promising students. One evening after one of their sessions at the youth center, Malik sat across from Ethan, his face filled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "They called me back for a second interview, Officer Grant," he said, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "I think I might actually have a shot." Ethan grinned, his pride evident. "You've worked hard, Malik. This is all you, and you deserve every bit of it." Malik looked down, his expression turning serious. "You know, I don't think I'd have come this far if it weren't for you. You showed me what it means to believe in yourself, and that you can always change, no matter what people think." Ethan's chest tightened, Malik's words striking a chord deep within him. "Thank you, Malik. But you taught me too. You taught me to look beyond the surface, to see people for who they really are." They shook hands, a silent agreement that their bond went beyond mentor and mentee. Malik was moving forward, but his roots in Riverside were strong, and Ethan was honored to have been a part of his journey. As winter set in, Ethan continued to deepen his connections within Riverside. He took on a new challenge, bringing local businesses, residents, and the police department together to discuss safety and community building. For years, the relationship between law enforcement and Riverside's residents had been fraught with tension, but Ethan was determined to bridge that gap. At the first community forum, Ethan spoke candidly to a packed room at the youth center, facing an audience of both hopeful and skeptical faces. "I'm not here to pretend the past hasn't happened," he began, his voice steady. "There were times when Riverside wasn't treated with the respect it deserves, and I was part of that problem. But today, I'm asking each of you to join me in rebuilding that trust, one step at a time." His words hung in the air, the silence tense and thoughtful. Then a young mother in the back raised her hand. "We want our kids to feel safe, Officer Grant, but we need to know that you see them as kids, not just potential troublemakers." Ethan nodded, his expression earnest. "That's exactly why I'm here, to show them, and you, that we're in this together, and to earn your trust every single day." Over the next hour, residents voiced their concerns, and Ethan listened, taking each point to heart. By the end of the meeting, a tentative hope had begun to fill the room, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. One afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected call from Captain Wilkins. She wanted to meet him back at his old precinct, to discuss the progress he'd made in Riverside and to explore future opportunities for him within the department. As Ethan drove back to his former precinct, memories of his previous life flooded back, each one a reminder of the assumptions and judgments he had carried for years. Walking into the familiar building, he felt like a different man, his sense of purpose and commitment far stronger than before. Captain Wilkins greeted him warmly, though there was a glint of curiosity in her eyes as she observed the changes in him. "Officer Grant," she began, gesturing for him to sit. "You've done well in Riverside. We're proud of the impact you've had there." Ethan nodded, a mix of gratitude and nostalgia filling him. "Thank you, Captain. Riverside has become more than an assignment. It's my community now." She leaned forward, her gaze serious. There's an opening in leadership here at the precinct, and we think you'd be a strong candidate. But it would mean leaving Riverside. Are you ready for that? Ethan considered the offer, feeling a tug between loyalty to his former precinct and his commitment to Riverside. After a long pause, he shook his head. I appreciate the opportunity, Captain, he said, his voice steady. But I belong in Riverside. There's still more work to be done, and I'm not finished there. Captain Wilkins smiled, understanding in her eyes. I respect that, Ethan. Riverside's lucky to have you. As he left the office, Ethan felt a sense of closure, a quiet affirmation that he'd made the right choice. His heart was in Riverside, and that was where he was meant to be. As winter turned to spring, the Riverside Festival, a long-standing tradition, was held in the park, drawing families, musicians, food vendors, and artists from across the neighborhood. It was a celebration of the community's resilience, its unique culture, and the bonds that held it together. Ethan walked through the bustling festival, nodding at familiar faces, stopping to chat with shop owners and local kids. He saw Mrs. Washington overseeing a baking competition, Malik running a booth for the youth center, and Officer Foster manning a barbecue station with his usual easygoing smile. As he strolled through the booths, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. He'd once seen Riverside as just another neighborhood, but now he saw it for what it truly was, a vibrant community filled with people who supported each other through thick and thin. Toward the end of the day, Malik found him near the music stage, where a jazz band played a lively tune. Officer Grant, Malik said, grinning, think you'll be around for the next festival? Ethan laughed, clapping Malik on the shoulder. Count on it. Riverside is home, Malik. I'm not going anywhere. They watched as the band played on, the air filled with laughter, music, and a shared joy that underscored the strength of Riverside. Ethan's heart swelled, knowing he'd found his place, not just as a cop, but as a true member of this community. Years later, Ethan remained in Riverside, now a respected figure in the neighborhood and a mentor to new officers entering the precinct. The people he'd once struggled to understand had become his friends, his extended family, and his life was richer for it. One afternoon, he stood in front of a group of rookie officers, preparing to give them a tour of the precinct. He could see himself in their eyes, the uncertainty, the eagerness, the need to prove themselves. Taking a deep breath, he addressed them. Riverside isn't just another assignment, he began, his voice firm but kind. This is a community that's strong, proud, and resilient. They don't need officers who just enforce the law. They need officers who see them, who respect them, who treat them like family. If you give this place your heart, it'll give you everything in return. The rookies listened intently, and Ethan could see a flicker of understanding in their expressions. He hoped they would carry the lessons he'd learned, that they would see Riverside for the remarkable place it was. As the rookies dispersed, Malik, now a young engineer working on community development projects, approached Ethan, a smile on his face. Still inspiring people, I see, Malik said, his tone teasing but warm. Ethan laughed, a sense of pride filling him. Trying to do my part, Malik. Just trying to make Riverside a little better every day. They shared a quiet moment, watching the neighborhood they both loved. Ethan knew that he'd left a piece of himself in every corner of Riverside, that he'd helped to make it a place where people felt safe, supported, and seen. And as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting a warm glow over the streets, Ethan felt a peace that came from knowing he'd found his true calling, not just as an officer, but as a friend, a mentor, and a permanent part of Riverside's enduring legacy. As the sun set over Riverside, and Ethan looked out at the neighborhood that had become his home, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Every corner held memories, lessons, and faces he would carry with him forever. If you enjoyed Ethan's journey of transformation, redemption, and finding a true sense of purpose, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power of change. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next one.